Interrogation 7. That's when you died, repeated Fawkes, rotating the statement in her head to see if she was missing something. That is what happens when you fall into space, explained Biter helpfully, as Makari's scratchy voice piped up again. They say they're not bitter about it. 9 years they lived. That's ancient for a grot, you know. Cassia was next, leaning forward with a groan of canvas and wrinkling her nose in confusion. But you're here, right now, in the room. She turned her head ponderously towards the translator, giving them a profoundly weary expression. Biter, is this a sodding ghost story? Don't be silly, reprimanded the blood axe. Ghosts are not real. But you died, said Hendrickson quietly, as if confirming the most trivial detail. Is that right? You died, did you? He had been standing motionless since Makari had said it, and now he only moved to fix the prisoner with the coldest, glassiest blue stare. He was calm as Makari nodded, dead still, with all the usual restless bluster drained from his stance, and Fawkes knew all too well what that meant. The darkness was stirring beneath the ice. Cassia shifted in her seat as she felt the rune priest's silent rage ripple through the room and reached out towards the space marine with an uncertain hand. Fawkes didn't need a psyker's gifts to know where Hendrickson's mind was at, but she did not reach out to him. She had decided to let it happen. It would not have been her choice. She wasn't even certain she had a choice. But as engrossing as Makari's tale was, this latest stretch of credibility was ridiculous. It demanded testing, and besides, she had been growing increasingly uncomfortable for some time now with the feeling that the interrogators were being played. The balance of power needed redressing, and Hendrickson was an expert leveller of playing fields. What use was a wolf if you never let it run off the leash? Go on, she said quietly, without even looking in the rune priest's direction. And violence happened. He moved like wind-stirred snow, still one moment, then whipping over the ground as if carried by some unstoppable force. And when her eyes caught up with him, he had Makari by the throat, held 9 feet in the air with chair, chains, and all swinging beneath them, and Hendrickson's bolt pistol, still loaded with its hollow-point shell, was in his free hand. The grot's limbs were stretched taut by the weight of the steel, tendons looking close to popping from the strain, and the creature's eyes bulged from the clammy skin on its face. Hendrickson's rune-inscribed fist closed around its scrawny neck, looking as if the smallest clench might pulverize the grot's spine to jelly. But still, his face was calm. Fawkes had underestimated the old wolf. He had not lost his temper at all. So, what would happen, inquired Hendrickson, gesturing with the gun, if I were to kill you now? Makari squeezed out a rattling croak. They say they would die, said Biter, who had been leaning, untroubled against a bulkhead throughout the encounter. And then? And then I should imagine you would have to clean up. Hendrickson hurled the prisoner to the floor, chair and all, like a fresh emptied ale horn, and bones snapped in the tangle of steel and green flesh. Then he rounded on Biter. You like to play games, do you not, orc? Said Hendrickson, moving across the cell until he towered over the mercenary in their shabby leather coat. But Biter continued leaning, with an expression of replete ease, even as the rune priest's face loomed down to within a few inches of their own. You think your safety is guaranteed here, I suppose. A guest in our hall. Not at all, said Biter. But that is not a concern. You know, after all, that my kind believe in re-incantation. But you would be a fool to kill me when I have not told you a lie yet. Is that so? Said Hendrickson, still icy quiet, as he gestured to the shape on the floor hissing in pain behind him. Yet you would have us believe the tale of a prisoner who speaks of events they were not present for, and then recounts their own death. You think yourselves clever, I know, intelligence officer. But this deception has been poorly clad. It reveals your wit as that of a beast. I do not see what is so hard to understand, protested Biter, seeming genuinely baffled. The grot with the burn scar died, Macari lives, and they have much tale left to tell. So, what about the other mark? Asked Cassia with studied calm, and Biter looked even more confused. The burn in the shape of Gaz's hand. Ah, replied the orc, that one comes and goes, like, what is the thing where your saints begin to bleed sometimes for no reason? Stigmata? Guessed Cassia. Yes, the burn scar belonged to the grot who died. The hand mark belongs to Macari. It's special. Right, murmured Cassia, unsure of where to go from there. At that moment, however, an alert message pulsed gently over Fawkes's vision. It was the brig's guards reporting that the shipment from the vivarium had arrived at last. After muttering a barely sincere prayer of thanks to the throne, Fawkes suppressed a shiver at the thought of the shipment's contents and cleared her throat to speak. Luckily for us all, we can settle this matter without recourse to further debate, as the cupbearer Zottel has arrived. There was a muted rumble of wheels in the darkness down the brig corridor, and then a dull light moving towards them past the reinforced cages that lined the passageway. The light was the headlamp of a haulage servitor, trudging along behind a low, heavy cart. As the vehicle approached, nightmare faces loomed briefly to either side of it in the dim glow of the lamp. Long, predatory fingers probed out between the bars of cages, then fell into the darkness as the cart passed. Something hissed in cruel anticipation. Many of the horrors down here had seen Zottel's visits before, and they knew what was to come. The door to Macari's cell rose with a rattle, and the servitor pushed the cart inside. It was around 9 feet long and chest-high, rounded at the front and tapering at its rear end like a casket built for a giant. It was covered with an ornate leather drape, and a console protruded from a mount on one side, bearing a flickering green oscilloscope and a dusty speaker grill. The servitor had some difficulty bending in order to clamp the cart's wheels, and the sight of the thing spasming, with a look of abject incomprehension on its face as it turned one way and then the other, was utterly wretched. "For pity's sake," snarled Hendrickson beneath his breath, and began moving over to assist the servitor. But Biter, to Fawkes's surprise, was already there, bending to lock the clamps with speed that was at once liquid and graceless, and then smoothly, gently even, turning the servitor back around to its original bearing. As the cart settled, there was a quiet noise of sloshing liquid from beneath the drape, and something like a muted, sloppy gasp. This time Fawkes could not hold back a bone-deep shudder. She did not like the cupbearer. In fact, she hated its present form, but its utility had been indisputable during its long stay aboard the Exactor, and for all she loathed it, it was not a prisoner, but a guest. So, she set her jaw and rotated her shoulders to relieve some tension, wincing at the hollow click that came, as always, from the right-hand socket, and pulled away the drape. Inside was a heavy armour-glass tank, filled nearly to the brim with murky, tannin-stained water. And in the water, surrounded by drifting fragments of decaying vegetation, was a shape. It was a mottled, greyish-beige in colour, bulbous at the front, and with a long, ragged-finned paddle tail wafting listlessly behind it. The shape moved forward with a lazy beat of its tail, stirring up a cloud of muck from the tank's floor until it was resting at the end of the aquarium facing the prisoner. As the speaker console crackled to life, emitting the muddy, distorted sound of moving water, the cupbearer rolled in the murk and turned its head sideways to press one pale, lidless eye against the glass. Beneath the eye, the crook of a long, snaggle-toothed jaw turned upwards in a sly smile. And, after taking in the sight of the prisoner on the floor, and then Biter, the creature spoke.
Gifts.
Zottel's voice was vile. Folks had no idea how the creature approximated human speech, given its lipless ambush predator's mouth, but from the grinding, creaking sounds picked up by the tank's hydrophone, she guessed it had something to do with the rasping of internal teeth.
What dish is this, most presumed delicious lady folks?
That is precisely what I have summoned you to ascertain, cupbearer.
It seems orc-like. Have you not something more exotic?
It might not be a new meat, Zottel, but its pedigree is astounding, or so it claims. You are to determine the truth of this.
A taste test, then. Unknown meats. These are good. Nourish me.
The cupbearer rolled slowly in delight, and on its loose, sallow belly, Folks saw the stubs of quills. It was hard to believe, but Zottel had been a Kroot once. A master shaper, no less, that had consumed its way into a living nightmare. Kroot culture was eating, and the creature's longing for new foods was nothing untoward in itself, but Zottel's appetite had been too curious, too prodigious, even for a society where cannibalism was daily custom. It had sought novel opponents with obsessive fervour, making its body a treasure hoard of stolen genetics as it consumed species after species. Inevitably, Zottel had become fixated on a desire for the one meat forbidden to it. The flesh of its species masters, the Tau. And at last, concealed by the smoke of a battle's aftermath, it had given in to temptation. The master shaper had torn a sliver from the body of a fallen warrior and had crossed a horizon from which there could be no return. After that, Zottel had gone rogue, rampaging through space in an orgy of consumption, with all caution eclipsed by ecstasy. Eating its masters had changed it in a way that made instant sense of the taboo long instilled in the Kroot. Zottel had learned to make drastic alterations to its own form, achieving in months the sort of change that would have taken other shapers generations. But more chilling still, it had learned to change its mind, and its brain had become a thing of horrible power. Fawkes had wondered, many times now, why she continued to offer the thing refuge. With the contents of Fawkes's brig to feed on, it had galloped through morphologies, with its body barely recognisable from one decade to the next, and it had become quite insane. One day she would have to put an end to it. But for now, the cupbearer was a formidable asset.
"Well, you heard the cupbearer,"
said Hendrickson to Biter, and the supposed Macari, unsheathing his combat knife with a flourish.
"It's hungry, so let's give it a prime cut."
The old wolf never seemed unnerved at all by Zottel, and even seemed to be finding some relish in its presence. But his satisfaction soured when he realised that neither of the two orcoids seemed any more bothered by the ex-shaper than he himself was. The supposed Macari sneered up from the floor as Hendrickson advanced with the knife, but as he reached out to make the cut, the rune priest paused and stroked his beard thoughtfully.
"Actually, Orc, I think I shall give you this honour,"
he said, and tossed the knife to the translator with a cruel smile. On many ships of the Ordo Xenos, it would be considered poor practice, to say the least, to throw a weapon into the hands of an unrestrained Orc captive. But this was not, Fawkes supposed, a typical ship of the Ordo Xenos.
"If you like,"
said Biter, keeping eye contact with the old wolf as they caught the knife by the blade with one hand.
"Take the flesh where the hand mark appeared," commanded Hendrickson, "and don't be gentle about it."
"I hadn't planned otherwise," said Biter, cool as the blade in their hand had advanced on Macari.
"Going to cut you now,"
the orc told the grot, and the grot just shrugged. The prisoner did scream bloody murder as the blood axe hacked away in a rough circle around the mark of Gazkul's hand, but it didn't struggle or try to writhe away from the blade. This was, Fawkes realised, just an orc hurting a grot, a confirmation of the natural order that the prisoner seemed to find so spiritually fulfilling. When the carving was done, Biter placed the blemish-free flesh unceremoniously in Hendrickson's palm with a damp slap, and handed him back the knife. Nodding once, the psyker tossed the scrap into Zottel's tank with a look of disdain, and wiped his hands on the thighs of his ship clothes as the water erupted in eager splashing.
"There, vile thing, enjoy your meal."
The Kroot prodigy snapped messily at the scrap of skin and meat, working its jaws to align with the fragments, and then gulping it down with an ecstatic roll of its eyes.
"A plain morsel, but such rich undertones. Unusual."
The interrogators were more than content to ignore the thing as it deliberated on the meat, and an awkward silence thickened the cell while Zottel smacked its lipless jaws in the water. Hendrickson began to pace, as was his habit when there was nothing else to do. If the now absent scar proved truly to be the mark of Gazkul, and the cupbearer would know it if it was, there would be many possible implications. All of them were unsettling. Fawkes was used to the unknown, of course, as it was the business of her life, but she preferred the unknown when it was a question of tentacles and claws. When it was physical, as strange and vile as alien life could be, flesh was inevitably comprehensible in the end. But whenever her duty took her into questions of the spiritual, she felt profoundly unsettled. It was still fundamentally against her belief to shy away from truth, and if the mark transpired to be genuine, she would continue regardless. But she would proceed with caution. The creature currently digesting its meal in the tank behind her was a fine reminder, after all, of where unbridled curiosity could take a person. The creature, which Biter was now inclining their head towards, ever so casually, with their brow ridges raised in intrigue.
"Your fish,"
Biter said.
"It does not look very well."
Mind alight with paranoia, Folks half expected a trick. But when Hendrickson looked up from frowning at his own feet, and she saw the shock light up in his pale blue eyes, she spun round to face the tank. The water was entirely choked with a mass of twisted green-tinged fungus. From the look of the thicket, it had all sprouted from a mass in the centre of the tank and had filled the container to its edges almost instantly. The few scraps of beige flesh visible amidst the profusion explained the rest of the story. Zottel had died an agonizing, silent death, and Biter and the battered prisoner had been watching the whole time, waiting until it was done to let them know. Folks felt a quiet horror seize her at the base of the neck, and her ceramite implant seemed to grow cold with it. The small part of her mind that took satisfaction in solving problems noted that at least the ever-nagging dilemma of what to do with the renegade Kroot was solved, but the rest of her, which had always been better at creating problems, was unmoved. Because now, in the proof of the prisoner's authenticity, she had what she had wanted since that first message burst from Biter's warband, and she wanted nothing more than to be rid of it.
"So, we have Makari on our hands after all,"
said Hendrickson gravely, in a tone which audaciously suggested he had suspected this all along. Cassia nodded, staring in mute disgust at the drifting, infested carcass of the cupbearer.
"Yep. Makari, who died halfway through his own life story, but who's still telling it."
Folks sighed, and wished for a moment she had aged comfortably into the kind of inquisitor who took one look at a threat before ordering it virus-bombed from orbit, praising the Emperor, and returning to some finely upholstered manse for a hot meal and a long evening with some dim but pleasant servant girl. Alas, she had not. And for all the enormity of the weirdness unfolding in the cell, it remained her duty, even if self-imposed, to pack it all away again. "Then I suppose," she said, feeling the full weight of her 136 years in her bones, "we had better find out what happened in the second half."
Chapter 7. Gazcoal gets something back. I was a grot, and I was running for my life. Couldn't tell you what planet I was on, who Gazcoal Thraka was, or anything like that. I'd come out of a hole in a tunnel not long ago, and had lived in that tunnel ever since, scraping fungus from the walls to put in a big metal bucket. I'd bullied the grots who was smaller than me, I'd been bullied by the grots who was bigger than me, and I'd grovelled to the orcs who'd occasionally come to collect the buckets. It had been a dark and squalid, terrifying life, just as the gods had intended for my sort. It had been perfect. This time, though, when the orcs had come down to the tunnels, they'd come with shooters, and they hadn't given a squig's cough about the fungus. There hadn't been any explanations, just bullets, and before I even figured out what was going on, half the grots in the tunnel had been shot to ragged pieces. As luck would have it, I'd been carrying the big metal bucket when it happened, and that's what saved me. A bullet had pinged off it right back into the shin of the orc who'd fired it, and I legged it while the orc was busy shouting at the bucket. The orcs had set after me right away with a whole pack of sniffer squigs, and although I'd got a good head start, it wouldn't last forever. I needed to lose them somehow. But how, when I was lost myself? I'd never left my tunnel before, and all the tunnels beyond it looked exactly the same. Then I smelled it. I didn't know what it was, and it was so faint that it must have been coming from miles away. But somehow I knew it meant safety, and as mad as that was, it wasn't like I had options. So I ran towards it. It led me upwards gradually, and after a while the tunnel started looking a bit different. The walls weren't fully grown over with fungus yet, and I saw they were made out of machines. Not proper orky machines either, but fussy ones with too many right angles. These had been someone else's tunnels not long ago. The further up I went, the more bare the walls got, and the less places there were to hide, which was bad news, because I badly needed a breather. In the end, I had to settle for collapsing behind a hump of shot-up machinery in a wide chamber where it looked like there'd been a big fight. I could already hear the squigs snarling in the tunnels behind me, but all the fear juice in the universe couldn't have squeezed another step out of me without a few gasps of air first. I was so puffed out, actually, that it took a moment for me to clock the other thing hiding behind the machine. It was like a grot, but infinitely worse. Its face was all flat and boring, like its ears and nose had been chopped off, and it wasn't even green. It was a human, of course, one of your larvae, I reckon, but I didn't know that then. I just thought it was some kind of rubbish animal. Its face was filthy, with streaks through the grime where the water was coming out of its eyes, and it wouldn't stop whimpering and putting its finger over its mouth while it stared at me, as if that was meant to mean something. I didn't care. The squigs had reached the chamber now, and I could hear the orcs too, barking orders as they fanned out to find me. "Why does it have to be this one anyway?" growled one resentfully. "'Cause he wants the lucky one brought to him, remember?" boomed another, which sounded like it was bigger. "And this one dodged all the bullets and managed to break Bin Feaster's leg with a soggy bucket. Sounds lucky to me." I was just trying to figure out how much worse my situation had got with the news that the orcs wanted me alive. There were grots in my warren who'd been taken away and come back with their limbs sewn on wrong, or extra bumholes, when I spotted the manacles on the other creature's wrists. There had been chains on them by the looks of it, but they'd been filed off. This thing was on the run too. Grots can think quick, you know, especially when their lives are on the line. Before that wretched creature could even wonder why I was suddenly grinning, I grabbed its arm, bit down hard on it so it screamed, and then kicked it out into the open. The orcs roared with laughter as they saw the thing, and the whole pack of squigs shot toward it with tongues lolling. Knowing what I do now about how fragile humans are, I'm amazed it screamed for as long as it did. Well, I didn't stick around to watch. As soon as it had stumbled out into the view of the orcs, I sprinted off in the other direction, ducked into a side tunnel and started heading towards the source of that weird smell again. The distraction had finally got the orcs off my trail, but I didn't stop running. As I carried on up through the maze of alien machines, I started coming across more and more orcs, so I kept to the shadows and the quiet places where I could. There had definitely been a big fight here not long ago, going by all the smashed-up barricades and stuff. But as I watched the orcs, I saw they were making it theirs, just as surely as the fungus was growing over the deep tunnels. They were setting up barracks, brew huts and fight sheds, while grots welded together squig pens and drilled drop holes in the floor. And for every mob of orcs headed into one of the new brew huts, another was on its way out, tooled up for a fight elsewhere. An orc could be born into a place like this and just be part of something straight away. At one point, my path took me sneaking across a gantry over a big pit full of vats, which I figured was some sort of place of making food. Working the vats, all chained together by the 100, were more of those weak, colourless creatures. They were being watched over by orcs with lashes and clubs, because they weren't even worth wasting bullets on. And as I snuck overhead, I saw what it was they were cooking up. Corpses of their own kind. I cackled so hard then that one of the guards looked up and I had to run again, but I couldn't help it. Now that I'd spent a while not running for my life, I was coming to realise that whatever this place was, it was brilliant. Even the being hunted down part would have been perfect if it had been happening to some other git. It was just something I'd come out of the ground knowing. An instinct, I suppose, that this, all of this, was what the world was meant to be like. Orcs doing exactly what they wanted, and grots coping with it, And other creatures too, like those wretches at the vats. 'Cause orcs might have been made to rule everything there is, but they wasn't made to be alone in the universe. You ain't really won something unless there's someone alive who knows they've been beaten, and you ain't going to have any more fights if you don't leave anyone wanting revenge. Eventually, after another few hours of skulking upwards past even more orcs, I got to a place where the smell I'd been chasing was thick in the air, and I reckoned that I'd nearly escaped. And when the smell led me into a hall tall enough for 100 grots to stand on each other's heads, held up by giant stone pillars and with a humongous pair of doors at the far end, I was certain. Through that door was freedom, and as luck would have it, it was open just wide enough for a runt like me to squeeze through. The problem was, after everything I'd seen, I wasn't so sure I wanted to escape anymore. I stood in front of that door trying to work it out for ages, and in the end, my mind got made up for me. "There's the little git!" bellowed a voice at the end of the hall, shocking me out of my daze, and I knew that voice just as well as I knew the baying of the sniffer squigs that started up along with it. I'd dithered so long that they'd caught my scent again and followed me all the way up. That was that. Without a second thought, I started ramming myself through the crack between the huge doors, and it was only once I'd wriggled nearly all the way to the other side that I wondered why the orcs behind me were roaring with laughter. "I ain't so sure he's that lucky after all," said one of them. "Run all this zogging way, ain't he, just to end up right where we was trying to take him in the first place?" He was so big, by then I didn't even notice him at first. I skulked into the big room beyond the doors, already cringing, because I expected it to be full of massive angry orcs. But it looked completely empty. Almost peaceful, as weird as that sounds. There was a giant round window, all fancy and gothic, like the windows on this spaceship of yours, and there was dim orange sunlight glowing through it. I don't know what exactly was happening on the other side, but it involved a lot of boom, rattles and rocket whooshes. I'd been born knowing what war sounded like it was in my blood, and there was no mistaking it here. Across the room from the window, hung up on ropes so they was facing it, was a row of dead humans. They were all dressed in uniforms with loads of buttons and gold string and stuff, like they thought they was special. But now they were just swinging slowly in the orange light, with bingits wandering all over their faces, just as dead as the corpses in the vats below. There were statues, too, of humans in yet more fancy uniforms. They'd had their faces bashed off and glyphs scrawled all over them, but among them, untouched, was one giant statue of an orc in armour stood facing the window with its brow crunched up in deep thought. I was getting dead confused as to why the humans would have wanted a statue of something like that. When it breathed, the giant turned from the view of the war and walked across the room to a huge table made from polished wood and gold, but covered in stripped meat bones. A hand as big as I was swiped away at a heap of detritus to reveal an orc-drawn map beneath, and the giant frowned down at it with one meat eye and one metal one. A wave of big cannon shots sounded on the horizon, and as I looked at that huge face staring down at the war map, it was like the gun thunder was the sound of its brain thinking. I still had no clue who this was, remember, but somehow I still expected it to look happier than it did. Instead, it looked like it had a head full of problems, all wrestling with each other and smashing into the walls of its skull. That wasn't how an orc should look. The giant grunted in frustration and scratched a glyph on the map with a lump of charcoal before sticking a knife in it as a placeholder. Then it reached for something else on the table and picked it up for a closer look. It was a banner, barely one, mind, just a hammered flat bit of sheet metal on a stick with something daubed on it in faded red-black paint. Looking at it only deepened the valleys creased into the leathery green of the giant's face. It winced like a knife had been shoved into its skull through one of the scar ridges where metal met bone, and dropped the banner, moving its hand to clutch the side of its head instead. The lips of its great maw drew back from cracked fangs, and from between those tight-clenched teeth came a long, shuddering growl. It weren't so much a growl of pain, because though orcs feel pain, sure enough, They experience it in the same way as light or sound or any of the other ways their bodies tell them stuff. Nah, this was frustration. Like its head suddenly weighed 10 times as much as it had done and wouldn't think right. "Ain't the same," said the orc, maybe to itself and maybe to the dead humans. It weren't talking to me, though, just as I'd not noticed the orc because it was so big. It hadn't noticed me because I was so small. "Ain't the same," it repeated, angrier now, and talking round another big wince from its head. "We're fighting. We're winning. There's slaves and loot. More every day. Why don't it feel right?" As the orc's space-deep voice got more and more contorted, I heard metal creak and saw the tiny banner bend under the force of those arm-thick talons. Was this warlord talking to a sign? "Curse yourselves," the orc hissed, glaring up at the ceiling before letting loose a roar that made bits shake free from it. "Why won't you talk to me? Ain't I done well enough for you? Ain't I taken enough?" The rage seemed to ebb a bit, and the giant looked back at the banner in its claws. "I done what you told me. Last time you spoke in the green, I sent for a grot, a lucky one. So, if that's your problem, zogging well solve it for yourselves. Send him back if that's what you want, if that means so much to you." "Stupid gods," cursed the warlord, and held the banner in front of its face, glaring sullenly at the little scrap of sheet metal. Then there was a little clicky whir, and the lens of the orc's metal eye spun, changing focus to look past the banner at the snivelling little speck of green it had noticed at the far end of the hall. The meat eye shifted slightly to follow it, and slowly, like a mountain rearranging itself, the orc lowered the banner and tilted its head down to look right at me. "You hear any of that?" asked the giant, lower and more threatening than the artillery in the distance, and I shook my head as much as I could with every muscle clenched in terror. And then I cringed as hard as I could, as if it could make me disappear, while the orc strode across the hall towards me, faster than anything that big should be able to move. There'd be no point in running, even if my legs hadn't been locked rigid with fear, so I pissed on the golden red carpet and waited to die. The great boss reached down with a hand as big as I was. "This is it," I figured. "I'm going to be eaten." But instead, it extended its thumb and first finger like the pincer off a seagit and grabbed my shoulder. "Might as well give this a go," it muttered. And even talking under its breath, the sound was like thunder, coming on a wave of hot breath that made my ears flap. "You," it said, stabbing a finger like a tree trunk towards my face. "You're Makari, you are." There was a searing heat in my skin where the two great fingers were touching me, and a flash of green light, so fierce it wiped away my sight. But when I could see again, I weren't looking up at some nameless giant. I was looking at Gazkal, the prophet of Gork and Mork, and looking at him because he was me now, and I was him, with a handprint on my shoulder to show it, was Makari, the Grot, his banner waver.
Interrogation 8. Armageddon. Did Gaz ever tell you why it was so important to him?
"I tell you this, Question Git. If there's one thing I wish, it's that he had. I have no idea why he was so mork-snicked obsessed with the place. I actually dared ask where we were going once, way back on Urk, and 'cause the boss was in a good mood that day, he answered. Sort of. All he'd say was that it was an important place. He was drawn to it like it was one of them sticky rocks. What are they? Magnets. Like he was a magnet, and it was an anvil. When World Killer left Urk, I reckon the whole thing got drawn along with him. Why was it important? Dunno. Not sure Gaz knew, really." The way he talked about Armageddon, when we were there, it was like it was a holy place, like there was some score to settle. I guess he knew the gods had their own reasons why it should belong to orcs, even more than everything else does, and that was good enough.
Cassia was leaning forward on her chair, looking genuinely fascinated.
Was it the gods that sent you back, Makari? Or did Gaz do it?
Do not talk of them as if they are real,
said Hendrickson, face etched with unease that was driven by far more than a base aversion to heresy. The idea that talking about something made it true was so natural to the orcoids in the room, it was starting to rub off.
In fact, do not talk of them at all, he continued. Let us hear of the war instead.
No, brother. We have all heard the story of the Second War of Armageddon. Let us hear the answer to Cassia's question. So, who put you back in the world, Makari?
No idea. Maybe I never left it. Maybe the Great Green was just the inside of all our heads, and I was an idea for a bit. Maybe it was all inside a magic boot. Why'd you keep expecting me to know how the universe works? When your grunts get chucked into one of your big wars, do the commissars take the time to explain the general's reasoning? Nah. They tell them to get stuck in and do the job. Same for me.
So, what was your job?
Have you even been listening? I'm a banner waver. I was there to wave a banner.
Gazco gave me the banner and told me it was waving time. Somehow it looked more impressive now it was in my hands. Perhaps it had a bit of a paint job since Urk. Seeing it stirred Gazco, and he shook off that strange unease he'd seemed to have been stuck in when I found him. It was like he'd reminded himself in a way, felt like he'd been in that fancy human room too long, thinking about tactics, trying to work out what to do when he should have just been doing. He'd given Bullets and all the other clan bosses missions, and they were all at the front being orcs, but he'd been so caught up in all that, he'd forgotten to go out and fight himself. And Grotznik, I was about to learn, had seen his isolation and hemmed him in like a legskit pouncing on something new in its web. I managed to find my way to Gazcol through grot-sized vents and tunnels, but as Gazcol led the way out of his new boss hall, I discovered if he wanted to get outside, the only way out was through a big room that Grotznik had filled with all his experimental medical gubbins. I'll say this for the doc, he'd upped his game since Urk. That room was crammed with rows of operating tables, and while some were for orcs, most had humans nailed to them. Some were missing bits, some had bits added to them, and some had been stapled together. Most of them were alive and screaming. In one case, a human had a grot's terrified head sewn onto its chest, shouting right back at it. And clanking around the room, swapping syringes and refilling blood buckets, were a small army of Grotznik's successes. Or his failures, it was hard to tell. Either way, they were orcs who'd had some or most of all their body parts swapped out with bits of machinery and more guns than you reckon would be essential for the practice of medicine. That made sense, I figured. Setting up here didn't just mean that Gazcol had to go through Grotznik to get to the rest of the world. It meant the rest of the world had to go through Grotznik to get to Gazcol. And with his collection of cyborgs to hand, the doc now had more than enough muscle behind him to decide whether they got through or not. The whole business stank. And there now was Grotznik himself, with his gnarly old hands in a half-conscious human's ribcage. Think he was replacing its heart with a squigs or something. When he heard Gazkel coming, he turned and his eyes went wide with surprise. "Mighty warlord," he said, trying to sound happy that Gazkel was out and about. "Going to take in the air?" "Nah," rumbled Gazkel. "Going to war." "But we have surgery scheduled," he blustered, removing the goggles. "The new implants?" "Of course, the great war boss does as he wishes, but without these new improvements I've planned, the headaches may get so much more nasty. It will be terrible to get one in front of the troops." "The git. I wouldn't have bet half a bad tin of squid guts that his so-called improvements were doing anything to help the prophet's headaches. Quite the opposite, I reckoned. The nerve of him, keeping the boss thinking he was sick, stopping him from being with his troops. It was like he was trying to make him his pet. Looking at him smirk, I couldn't help it. Gawk, bless me, I lost my temper. Boss says he wants to fight, git, I snapped, gnashing my teeth. Or do you need to work on your own ears? When he saw me, Grotznick's face went blank, and then reset into a look of proper hate. It was like he knew who I was straight away, but before he could say anything, Gazcoal curled up his finger and thumb and flicked me flat on my face. Oi, he said as I spat out a smashed fang. Less of that. It's ungodly. He's an orc, you're a grot, right? I snivelled, as was right, and retreated behind the boss again. He ain't wrong, though, said Gazcoal. Surgery's off, and if I get a headache in front of the troops, then I'll get a headache. And that was that. We left the laboratory, and although I couldn't resist turning round and smirking at Grotznick before the door shut, that was the last we saw of him for a good while. We went out onto a wide steel parapet then, and it was so bright I had to close my eyes for a good few seconds, but when I opened them again, I saw something magic. The fortification we were standing on was right at the top of a hump of metal as big as a mountain. A city somehow, like a nest built by stinging gits, only big enough to punch up into the guts of the sky. And all around it, in every direction, was a massive, beautiful war. Tiny dots moved in swarms, which I thought were orcs and humans at first, until I made out the little exhaust plumes rising from them. They were only zogging war machines, moving in squadrons too big to bother counting, through a sea of rubble and smoke and bodies. Orcs gathered together into a tide that couldn't be stopped, and all the humans they could ever want to kill. They were fighting and winning and growing stronger with every moment. It was a war, but more than that, it was holy. As I gawked, the boss was talking about fronts and sieges and encirclements and that, blood axe stuff. I'd barely had any idea what he was on about, but the gist was that we were thrashing your lot. Still, it sounded like Gazcoal wasn't quite satisfied with it all. He didn't have that certainty he had on Urk, that faith which had kept him still as a statue through those days in the icy dark. It was almost like he didn't know what to do. The boss stopped talking altogether after a while. I got the sense that he was leaving the air clear, so that if by any chance Gork and Mork had happened to give me the big list of their plans for Gazgoal while I'd been dead, I could reveal it now. I knew then that was why I was back, because Gazgoal just wasn't sure anymore. But he was out of luck, because it's not like I'd been in the brew hut with the gods all the time I'd not been alive, having chats and stuff. I'd just been dead, you know. Well, I suppose you don't. Anyway, I had nothing useful to say, so I just stood by Gazgoal and kept looking out at the war. The sun was setting by then, blazing red like Gazgoal's eye through big clouds of volcano smoke, and out of that smoke came the best things I'd ever seen. They was Gargants, a whole big herd of them coming out of the dust with their huge angry faces making them look like gods themselves. But as big as they were, they seemed tiny for being so far away. And that's what made me realise what the problem was here, that even the biggest things look little when they're miles away. It was like that for Gazcoal. He might have had more power than ever, but it was being conducted through a much longer reach, and it made him smaller, if you like. It's one reason why your lot are so rubbish at fighting, I reckon. Your emperor's just some git on a chair who might be dead half the galaxy away, and he doesn't even shout at you through a box or anything.
Are we going to let that stand?
Asked Hendrickson wearily in Fox's mind. Even his zeal was fatigued from the onslaught of blasphemy that the interrogation had produced by now.
We've had enough disruptions already,
replied Fawkes non-committally, doing her best to conceal the fact that Makari had accidentally struck upon one of her deepest anxieties about the state of mankind.
Let it pass.
Back on Urk, Biter went on, unaware of the minor theological crisis going on in her head. Gazcoal,
only had to walk out on his balcony to be with his troops. But, penned in the middle of that human city by Grotznik, he might as well have been on another planet. It was hurting him. Gaz needed to go where he'd be seen, where he could remind the mobs personally what they were about, and where, if I'm going to flatter myself, they could see my banner. He needed to do something properly orky, so I thought about different tactics I'd heard of and how I could suggest 'em without it seeming like I was telling him what to do, and in the end, as the gargants waddled across the red-lit waste before us, I said it.
Biter lit up then, like they were really relishing the words they were about to translate. They even raised a finger to accent their performance, medals gleaming greasily on their puffed-up chest as they gave a crafty look up to an imagined Gazkul of their own.
Have you considered a full charge at the enemy with everything we've got? Gazkul wasn't taken with it.
Said he spent the whole of the war so far trying to get the clan bosses, all of them except stratagem admittedly, to realise there was such a thing as other tactics besides just chucking everything at your enemy. But then sitting and thinking about it all was just giving him headaches, and I think he suspected the gods were getting bored. So I told him he should just do what he wanted to do, because he was an orc after all, and that's what orcs should do. He was quiet for a little bit, then he twitched his head to the side like he just spotted something. I have an idea, he said. What did I say back in the hall about thinking when I should be doing? Nobody had said that. It was something I'd thought. I ain't said it out loud, though, so that was weird. Would you have wanted to correct Gazgo on that? Yeah, I thought not, so I nodded. I should be just getting stuck in. The gods won't tell me how, because it's so obvious I should have seen it by myself. I should just do what I want. They'll make themselves heard through that. And what do I want? Big charge, I reckon, with everything. South. Volcanoes are going off, so it'll be dead hard. And there's that jungle. Gaskell nodded, mind made up. Yeah, it'll be good. Really good. I'm going to take one of those gargants and head south. Bring the banner. I felt relief, like you feel when you make it over a mate's face just before the guard squig gets you. The prophet was all right. Letting me give advice was one thing, but if he'd have gone with it, I don't think I could have believed in him quite like I had done. And yeah, I realised he did sort of go with my advice, but it had gone through his brain and come out again as his, so it wasn't like I told him what to do. We went south, and it was really good. It might have been the best thing ever.
Folks listened with a mounting sense of despondency as Makari described one of the most perilous conflicts in mankind's history as if it were a militarum conscript remembering a grand old night of shore leave. Armageddon's nightmarish equatorial jungle, which the incompetent Governor von Straub, a believer in the imperial truth, if ever there was one, had thought impassable, had proved a playground for the swarm of orcs that had gathered around Gazkul. Makari hooted with glee at how Grudbolg's snakebites had stabbed their way through a whole ecosystem somehow comprised of apex predators. It talked about volcanic hyperstorms as if they had been light shows put on purely to celebrate its masters, and described clashes with imperial armoured columns as if they had been amusing mishaps taking place after one too many drinks. The nadir of the account was undoubtedly when Makari got to the battle of the Mannheim Gap, where the godlike might of the Legio Metallica had been squandered by von Straub in a doomed counterattack on Gazkul's offensive. Hearing the near annihilation of a Titan Legio reduced to a load of massive metal lads having a fistfight was depressing to say the least, but it also gave folks the most bizarre sting of envy. Mannheim Gap was a source of genuine grief for humanity. The fallen Titans had been irreplaceable, not just materially, but spiritually, walking bastions of hope in a sprawling dark where such a thing was more precious and finite than any material wealth. And while the orcs had lost twice as many of their dreadful gargants, the atomic rupturing of their own war machines had been just as thrilling to them as that of the Titans. It was all just fireworks to them, she thought bitterly. Broken toys, to be replaced with new ones. Even when they lose, she realized, with a coldness settling on her gut, they're winning. And as Gaz pushed forward the front of his invasion, the orcs were winning anyway. It seemed the warlord was at last fulfilling the desires that had consumed him on Urk, and it was clear, from Makari's animated state, even with its smashed nose, its shattered arm, and the ragged wound on its shoulder, that it was in a state of perfect contentment just recalling it.
"It was the best time we ever had together," Biter said, "and I do mean together, sort of. I mean, I was still scum to him as it should be, but he was proud in his way. It was then that he made me this."
Biter gestured at Makari with their chin, and Folks saw the Gretchen was proudly rattling its necklace of relic shrapnel.
"He made a necklace for you,"
deadpanned Cassia.
"How lovely."
Makari paid no heed to the jibe, though.
"I stood just behind him in every battle,"
it gushed, rambling so fast that Biter struggled to keep up.
"I taunted his enemies when he came for 'em, and then I kicked their bodies after he'd downed 'em. It was just us, doing what we did best."
"Just you, apart from 100 million orcs," corrected Hendrickson, and this at least earned some scorn.
"I meant there was no Grotznik,"
said Makari through the translator.
"'Cause he was still stuck up in High Volcanus. There was nothing to meddle with what the gods wanted, and I felt like maybe Armageddon was a holy place, that we was building the Great Green there one fight at a time. I dodged every shot that came at me somehow, or maybe the bullets swerved round me, like when that orc tried to shoot the grot I'd been back in the warren under the city, and hit the bucket and shot himself instead. And even more'n on Urk, I started being known as a sort of good luck charm. Orcs who'd usually not think twice before kicking me out of the way treated me with respect. They even asked my permission sometimes before touching the banner."
Makari's face turned sour then.
"Makari didn't like that at all,"
noted Biter helpfully, while the grot had paused to think.
"I suppose what sorted that out was the tank,"
the blood axe said pensively in his Makari voice.
"Sometimes, when there's scraps going spare, grots build tanks. They're awful. And with all the excitement of the war and all the scrap the mech wagons had been grabbing as we moved south, a load of the Horde's grots had made a tank, a huge one, still rubbish, but as big as one of your bin blades, and well, they called it Big Makari in my honour."
Makari was cringing now, as it heard Biter say the name, and looked profoundly uncomfortable.
"It had my face done on the front with spaceship guns for eyes."
"Which he must have hated," Folks inferred, "since you don't honour a grot, and so on and so forth."
"Yeah, at first,"
said the orc, after conferring with Makari.
"But he came around to it. They said it was all right in the end, partly because the tank caught fire the first time it fired its main cannons, and every grot aboard it burned to death, but also because the tank didn't honour a grot.
It honoured Makari. Do we have to have a debate about that?
The orc asked the question innocently enough, but Fawkes was beginning to notice just how often the blood axe probed the edges of her tolerance under the guise of frank talk, and it turned her already dark mood pitch black. No, Xenos. In fact, I think we have heard more than enough of glorious victories altogether. As I said, we've all heard the story of this war. There's little to learn from hearing it retold through gloating. Tell Makari to move ahead in the story. Ask it about Hive Hades and about Yarrick. Fawkes looked right at the prisoner as she spoke, and just as she suspected, the malevolent joy fell right off its face as it heard the legendary commissar's name. Seeing that grotesque little face twist in sudden misery was a tonic, and Fawkes treated herself to the smallest gloat of her own. We have talismans of our own, after all, and few are more potent than Yarrick. I want to hear all about how he beat Gazkul.
Chapter 8. Gazkul's Dilemma. We were still winning when the siege of Hades began, and we kept winning. But there came a moment, like that moment where you smell that a storm is going to break, where every orc on Armageddon realised that we should have won by now. If von Straub had stayed in charge, we would have done. He was like Dregmeg, a braggart, but the bad kind, and the boss had picked apart his defences just as mercilessly as he picked apart the Death Skull war boss body in Rustbike. Yarrick, though, when that old bastard took over, things were different. He didn't have enough of any of the things he needed to keep us out of Hades, but he still managed it, because he knew he had to hold out. That was his reality, and he was too stubborn to let anything change that, even Gazkul. He had a will that seemed almost like an orc's when you're up against it, and the boss couldn't believe his luck in having come up against such an unlikely specimen of humanity. I remember when the first big push on Hades failed. It had been an airborne assault using Evil Sun's bombers, packed with battalions of General Stratagem's best shock troops. Instead of bombs, they had Deathskull guns, Goth-forged armour and explosive bullets from the Bad Moon powder mills, plus packs of feral snakebite squigs, just so all the clans could get in on it. The Hive had nowhere near enough anti-air guns to see off even a tiny bit of that attack. But do you know what Yarrick did? He took every artillery piece that had been bombarding our lines from the Hive's walls, and he turned them so they pointed straight up. Just like that. He had so many guns that he didn't need to aim, and not one bomber made it back. When the boss heard, it took him a while just to accept it had happened at all. He kept just shaking his big head and insisting that Yarrick hadn't done such a thing at all, because only he himself could have done something so cunning. But then Gazkul stepped outside his boss wagon and saw the bits of smoking red metal strewn over the landscape. Then he went berserk. He kicked the orc who'd given him the news to death, and then another three who just happened to be nearby, just to calm down enough to talk. And when he could speak, he actually cursed Yarrick. It was the first and last time I ever heard him angry at an enemy, and it could only mean one thing. He had a grod. Yeah, I know. What's a grod, right? I bet there's no human word for it, just like there's no orc word for that thing where a human really likes another human, and it causes loads of problems. Actually, I suppose the concept ain't that different now I think about it. A grod's a favourite enemy, if you like. Now, for an orc to have a grod who ain't an orc is rare. But for an orc like Gazkul to have a human grod was mental. I suppose it helped that Yarrick was a bit like an orc, although I doubt he ever thought of it like that. He even had a claw just like Gazkul's, and it was so big on that puny body of his that it should have toppled him right over, but it didn't, because he didn't want it to, and that was more orky than the claw itself. Anyway, Gazkul kept smashing his head against the problem of Hades and Yarrick, but no matter what he tried, it wouldn't give. It was the old thing about an irresistible fist and an immovable face. You know, could Mork make a box so proper that Gork couldn't kick it open and such? And eventually, after months of this, it got to Gaz Cole. For the first time in his whole life to date, he questioned whether he really was an irresistible fist after all. But orcs always think they'll win, right? Yeah, I thought the same. But Gaz Cole's mind had become something very different from the mind of any other orc who lived in a long, long time. He could imagine being beaten. And more than his size, his strength and his cunning, that was the thing that made him unique. I like to think it became his greatest strength eventually, but back then, when he was feeling it for the first time, it was a weakness. And it nearly did for all of us. I had a hammock tucked away in the rafters of the throne room of Gazcal's boss wagon, which I'd climb up to for a few hours' kip whenever there wasn't a night fight on that I needed to wave the banner for. Usually I had the place to myself, because Gazcal was way too hard to need sleep, and tended to spend the night outside, roaring with the clan bosses who followed him from Urk as they gambled and feasted and fought. And if Gazcal weren't in the throne room, it was just a room, weren't it? So I got probably the only peace and quiet in the whole of the Orc siege lines. But one night, I got woken up by what I thought was thunder, or artillery, until I realised it was words, Gazcal's words. "I ain't sure the gods believe in me anymore." I peered down over the edge of the hammock, looking to see who he was talking to. But there was just him, sitting dead still on his throne, with all the lamps unlit so you could only see his metal eye glowing red in the dark. He had the same air to him that he'd had when I found him at the start of this round of being Makari, only about 6 times worse. And he reeked of fungus brew. It weren't right. "We're only gonna keep winning if the boys believe we are." I thought about answering then, but something told me I shouldn't, so I kept listening. "The boys will only believe that," he continued, staring ahead into the dark. "If the bosses believe it, and the bosses will only believe that if I believe it." He took a huge breath in and gave an even huger breath out, and then spoke so low it could have been the wind outside. "But I ain't sure I believe it, and I ain't sure, because I ain't sure the gods believe in me." I carried on saying nothing, but make no mistake, I weren't hiding. I was certain the boss knew I was there, even though I was out of sight up in the roof. But if I spoke back, then that'd mean the boss was talking to me. And if it's hard to imagine the most powerful orc in the galaxy admitting weakness, then imagine him admitting it to a grot. If I stayed quiet, on the other hand, then we could both of us pretend I was eavesdropping, and it wouldn't technically be any different to Gazcal talking to himself. By the sounds of it, the boss had some things he needed to say, so I lurked, just like I used to do back on Urk during the boss's plotting sessions, and I gave him someone to be overheard by. "They've stopped talking to me. I still get the headaches, but there's no green in them. Just darkness, and I don't know if it's because I should know how to win without them telling me, or if it's because they found some other orc who's worth more talking to, somewhere else. Either way, I've let them down." Now, orcs might not be able to feel fear, but I will remind you that grots very much can, and I was more scared than I'd been in my lives. Gazcal not feeling up to it was like, well, I was going to say it was like the sun going out. But Gazcal's seen that happen once and beaten it through sheer confidence. This was worse than that. Gazcal's horde was unstoppable, but even the biggest machine's got one cog that'll grind the whole thing to a halt if it jams. And here, the cog was Gazcal. "I don't feel like the rest of them, like the bosses. It started on Urk, but it's worse now. That lot, they live to fight. It gives them everything they need, like it should be. And I act like I'm the same, I beat them at arm wrestling. I bet on squig fights. I drink until they are sick. But I'm pretending. I've lost my Rakrazar, my battle bliss. I need more. The boss said nothing for so long that I wondered if he was done. And when he did speak, he sounded so lost that I could hardly believe this was the same orc I'd watched beat a giant wart thing into pulp aboard the World Killer. I need something else, said Gazcol, but I don't know what it is. The next day, Gazcol tipped me out of my hammock for another day's banner waving. It was just him and me again, but neither of us let on that the night before had even happened. As long as we did that, I figured it wouldn't have happened. That was the theory anyway, but it didn't work. That evening, as the day's attack plan failed, it was a gargant with a big drill on it, but Yarrick dug a tunnel right under its arse and blew it up. Gazco celebrated along with the other clan bosses. But now I knew what was going on under that metal plate of his. I could see he was just pretending. As the days went on, I felt it spread. Wasn't like anyone had actually figured it out, mind. They didn't know the prophet had lost his faith. But they knew. The war shouts got weedier. Trucks went slower. Guns seemed to run out of ammo quicker, and cannons blew themselves up more often. The whole war got a tiny bit less holy every day, and it got worse by such tiny steps that nobody would have noticed, unless they were looking, which of course Gazcal was. And I knew that the worse it got, the more he'd be sinking into that head of his. That might surprise the big hairy human, but I was actually relieved the day his lot finally showed up to save the day for Yarrick. By which I mean the Space Marines, not the grey ones like him, though. It was the red ones and the blue ones and the green ones, all dropping down at once across the whole of the planet. And yeah, I'll say it, then we weren't winning anymore. We were getting battered. Gazcol stuck at it for a while, smashing away at the walls of Hades as if nothing had changed. I think he knew the war was doomed, but he spent so long trying to beat his way into that Morksnick city that he simply couldn't leave it unbroken. And in the end, to be fair, he did get inside, but there weren't much point in it by then. The horde from the World Killer, which had once seemed like it could never run out, had been dwindling for a good while. And when the fighting finally stopped in the twistiest, turniest little corridors under the hive, Gazcal had lost nearly half what he had left. Worse yet, because he'd been so focused on that one city, every other front had fallen to bits. At least Yarrick got away, so Gazcal still had his grod, but it weren't much consolation. I thought the boss was going to give up after that, and he could have done easy. If he'd chosen to run headlong at the nearest lot of beakies, the clan bosses would have followed him happily to death, knowing that he'd had a decent run at conquering the universe. Certainly a better go than most orcs ever got to have. Gazcal didn't give up, though, thank Gork, because decent wasn't good enough for him. What he'd managed on Urk and what he'd nearly managed here had been special. It had been something new, which ain't something you can say of many orc wars. And even if he'd mislaid his faith, he couldn't give up on the whole thing. In the brew huts, they call it a blood axe goodbye. It's when you tell your mob you'll get around in after you've been to the drops, but then you leave without paying and never come back. That's what Gazcal did. He made a big speech announcing that they'd nearly conquered the planet and ordered a big final assault on Hive Tartarus, which he said was the last human-held city in the world. It was all a load of rubbish, of course, and he'd chosen Tartarus by dropping a knife into his throne room map. But as far as any orc knew, he was still speaking the will of the gods, so they charged off happily to their deaths. Then quietly he gathered up the clan bosses, as well as Grotznick, I was miserable to learn, and we all sodded off in a spaceship while Yarrick and the Beakies were distracted at Tartarus. I'd hoped that wiping the slate clean at Hades and leaving would bring Gazcal back to his old self. You know what I said about Gork and what he likes to do with a grot's hope? He did put on a good show. Any other warlord would have been asking for a shanking from his cronies after a defeat like Armageddon. But the boss still knew how to do a speech, and the beating of the mind he gave the clan bosses as their ship left the system was a proper walloping. He said that this war hadn't been the end of their great rampage, but the very start, a sort of test run, if you like, for learning how humans worked and how best to defeat them in the future. He taught them about the importance of knowing your enemy, like I reckon the sour-looking human over there fails to teach her bosses all the time. Like I say, it was a good speech. It certainly won the bosses over. And Bullets even made a little speech of his own, about how they'd find another world like Urk, build up a giant horde all over again and head back to Armageddon to finish the job. They all cheered then, and had a big fight to celebrate while Gazkal watched, and Grotznik took measurements to see how much his head had grown. I don't know what the doc thought of Gazkal's speech, but I know he had his planning something face on as he fussed over the boss with his measuring stick, and if there was one orc who knew what was going on in Gazkal's brain, well, it'd be the one who'd stapled it together in the first place. Anyway, that's one truth about Armageddon, that the defeat was deliberate, and just the opening bit of a big master plan concocted by Gork and Mork. And there's a second truth, too, that only Gazkal and me, and maybe Grotznik, knew. That we got the snot kicked out of us fair and square, 'cause Gazkal lost heart. And there it is, the real proper truth about Gazkal Mag Uruk Thraka. Can I go now?
Hendrickson actually laughed. Not a bitter cough of scorn or a mocking cackle, but a genuine raucous ale-hall bellow that boomed through the whole of the brig. It was as if the whole of the interrogation had been nothing but the set-up to this punchline, and he had appreciated the effort enough to briefly put his anger aside for mirth.
So, you expect us to believe, he said, after steadying his breath, that Gazkul Uruk Thraka, the mightiest, most ambitious, most toweringly brutal monster in all the foul green host of Orkdom, became depressed.
Just saying it made him laugh again, but as Biter explained the concept of depression to Makari, taking quite some time over it, his amusement faded. As the blood axe spoke, the prisoner seemed confused at first, but then its murderous little eyes widened in astonishment, as if it had just found the answer to a riddle it had gnawed on for years, and it yipped a single phoneme at the translator.
Absolutely, yes,
reported Biter, and Hendrickson's face fell, unsure of what this meant.
That's certainly a piece of information,
said Cassia, looking just as bewildered. Fawkes, however, felt something like triumph for the first time since she had entered the cell. She had acquired Makari, hoping to get inside the mind of the creature's master and learn its weaknesses. And now that hope had been achieved. Whatever else transpired, the operation had paid for itself in knowledge. But Fawkes's mind was not one to sit for long in contentment, and it was maybe 3 seconds before it had managed to hitch a worry to her sense of achievement. "It certainly is," she said, following on from Cassia, and then she spoke her mind aloud. "But it does beg a fairly significant question. If this is Gazkul's great vulnerability, then why have you just divulged it to his enemies? The Warlord's retreat from Armageddon already has a watertight rationale, so why did you expose the truth of it? You seem unusually cooperative all of a sudden."
"Well,"
said Biter, not even needing to consult the captive,
"perhaps you are aware that Makari disappeared for a number of years following the retreat from Armageddon. There is a reason for that."
We were headed to some dump of a world called Golgotha, since some cogitator in High Volcanus had listed it as being full of orcs, and we didn't have any other ideas. And by we, I mean Gazkal. He didn't have much of anything in that strange epilogue to the war. He played along with the raucous shipboard life of the clan bosses just as well as he'd played along before. But now they was all packed in together on that poky spaceship, it was dead clear just how different from them he'd become. Just as Gazkal's body had grown to dwarf those of lesser orcs, so too had his mind, and as the voyage went on, he spent more and more time holed up on his own, away from them all. Grotznick, of course, jumped on the boss's solitude like a bingit on fresh stick. He made up for all the time he'd lost while Gazkal had been away from Volcanus, spending more time tinkering with the boss's bonds than not, it felt like, and I was certain he was doing everything he could do to agitate the Prophet's crisis. The headaches, which hadn't been that bad during the stalemate at Hades, came back bigger than before, with seizures as nasty as any the Prophet had been gripped by on Urk. And while Grotznick's constant presence stopped me being able to ask, even if I'd been bold enough to, I was sure that Gazkal saw him as further proof that he'd been dropped by the gods. More than that, I became certain that the doc knew what was going on with Gazkal. The way I saw it, Grotznick saw Gazkal as his creation and wanted to keep him bogged down in doubt and madness until he finally cracked and became the doc's personal monster. Bullett's declaration of a return to Armageddon had only been a suggestion, really, but Grotznick reinforced it constantly during the boss's long bouts of surgery, repeating the idea that it had been Gazkal's own plan over and over until the boss seemed to think so himself. Personally, I couldn't have hated the idea more, and Grotznick rooting for it only entrenched me further in hating it. It was true that Armageddon had a certain pull to it. That strange, godsly feeling we all had felt during the war was something that stuck with you, even as a grot, and it was easy to see why the Death Skull boss had been so quick to suggest it for the next scrap. But to me, and especially to the bit of me that was Makari, it was a huge waste of potential. The Great Green was about unity, about finally connecting every one of the teeming, scattered pockets of orcdom in the galaxy and getting them all together for the war to end all wars. I even wondered sometimes if Gazkal should have dropped his mobs on Armageddon early on in the fight and headed straight off to keep recruiting. I definitely thought this was the case now. With the war left behind, it was the perfect time to learn a lesson about getting bogged down and begin mustering a force so big it could swamp planets without even slowing. But instead, Gazkal was all but ready to scrape up a repeat version of the force he'd left Urk with and head right back to the place that had beaten it. The place which Commissar Yarrick would be working night and day to turn into the very zogging definition of a box so proper that Gork himself couldn't kick it open. Another Armageddon war was the simplest option open to us. It was what any other warlord would have done. But Gazkal weren't just any old warlord. Part of his genius had always been in getting past the idea that the simplest, quickest, fightiest option was always the best one. So why, I thought to myself, was he settling for this rubbish? Everything that had come to pass before now, the unification of Urk, the exodus on the World Killer, and the second chance Gazkal had won himself by scarping from Armageddon, it was all going to go to waste, purely because the boss was sulking too hard to come up with a better plan than someone called zogging bullets. When we got near Golgotha, I decided to do something really reckless. The sort of thing that should have been unthinkable for a grot. But I was starting to feel like the only thing on that ship that gave two teeth about the gods anymore, so I resolved to do it for their sake. I was going to tell Gazkal he was making a mistake. Believe me, I wanted to leave it, to let him come to his own senses on Golgotha and realise in his own time that he was on course for a repeat of the disaster we'd just left behind. But I couldn't be sure that had happened. And if I didn't speak my mind now, I wasn't sure I'd get another chance. Because remember, I was stuck in a metal box with Grotznick, who's probably the most devious sod I've ever had the bad luck to meet, and who not only held a massive grudge against me, but had already managed to kill me once. Already I clocked his cyborgs loitering about with knives down dark corridors on the ship, and it was only a matter of time before one of them found a corner I didn't think to check for murderers. In the end, though, it weren't Grotznick I should have worried about. When I plucked up the nerve to confront the boss, we was on the ship's bridge, in one of the rare moments where none of the clan bosses were around and Grotznick was getting some shut-eye. Gazkal was staring moodily out into space, and it seemed like a bad time to interrupt him. But then, when was it ever not? Now or never, I thought, and opened my gob. Smecken und schnicket knack, I said to him, my voice coming out higher pitched than usual because of the fear in me.
You what?
Said Gazkal, taken aback, as if a spanner had just asked him a question. So what you told 'em back on Urk after the unification, grot phrase, hide now, stab 'em later?
Yeah, I know,
said the boss, more confused than angry so far.
Why are you on about that?
'Cause this idea about going back to Armageddon, I said, gulping.
What about it?
Said Gazkal, and looked right at me. I realised then that I'd never actually made eye contact with him before that moment, and I never wanted it to happen again. Even though he only had one eye, there was enough threat in it to melt clean through steel, let alone a grot's courage. But I whispered a panicky plea to Mork in my head and carried on. You might win it, I squeaked, and then thought better of it. You will win it, I corrected myself, even though we both knew I'd been right the first time. And when you do, you'll have a planet. But if you don't go back there, you could have 1,000,000 planets. Gazkal just stared at me, not moving a muscle, and I figured at this point he'd either started changing his mind or was just waiting to see how much I'd dare say before he killed me. I'd crossed the line either way, so just like I was in a spaceship right on the edge of a black hole, I stuck the engines on full blast and hoped for the best. When you showed me the Great Green, back when I made the banner, every star in the sky was green. It was the whole galaxy ruled by orcs, not just Hades' hive. I was hyperventilising now, and my heart felt like it was about to shake itself apart, but I felt green fire in me, and it was like it burned away the fear. Boss, you managed to get the 6 most stubborn gits on Urk working together with just your brain and your fists. There's a whole galaxy of gits just as stubborn, all scrapping with each other when they could be turning the whole thing green. And you're the only one who can bring them together. The gods do believe in you, boss. Bullets and Ugrak and all the lot believe in you too. I believe in you, and I'm a bleeding grot. The only person who don't believe in Gazkal right now is Gazkal. It was only when I heard the echo of my voice that I realised I'd been shouting. But somehow I still didn't feel scared, and against everything I expected, Gazkal was thinking it over. Rolling his jaw about, it was, like he was chewing the thought of it. Then his head settled, and he looked at me again. His eye looked less killy now, which I thought had to be a good sign.
Yeah,
he said.
You're right.
Really? I said, because I hadn't expected it to be that easy.
Oh, yeah. It's clear, isn't it? I must have stopped believing in myself, or you started believing a bit too much in yourself, Makari.
Gazkal stood to his full height then, head scraping the bridge ceiling, and he was a spitting image of the figure from the end of that vision I'd just reminded him of. Only this time, he didn't look half as friendly. The fear was back all at once.
Either way, as you like to say, if a lowly, stick-thin little streak of offal like you reckons it can tell me what to do, something has gone wrong.
He took a step forward then and stooped down slowly, his head coming closer like a green mounting until it was only a couple of tusk lengths from mine.
Hasn't it?
He said, soft as ash, and the force of his breath still nearly knocked me over. Yeah, I said, because contradicting him now didn't seem the smart choice.
It's useful, though, you talking to me like this.
Is it?
It is. You've reminded me that a real orc doesn't take counsel from grots. A real orc, Makari, and I'm as real as it gets, doesn't even take counsel from the gods. or from anyone but himself. You,
he said, and extended a single talon till it touched my shaking chest.
You were a mistake, a weakness that I thought was a strength. But from now on, there will be no more mistakes. There will be only strength. You tell Gork and Mork I'll be all right without 'em,
said Gazcal, with the bleakest smile I ever saw, and he put his thumb and forefinger to the sides of my head, and then he squeezed, and with a wet pop like a grot's head getting burst, my second life was over.
Interrogation 9. So that was it, said Fawkes after a while, not quite sure what else to say.
For a long time at least, yeah,
said Biter gravely.
Makari has told me that if you want to know about what went down on Golgotha, you'll have to go and ask Yarrick.
I'd rather not, said Fawkes. The man deserves every bit of his status as a hero of the Imperium, but he's possibly the most uptight, self-righteous bore I've ever had the displeasure of being seated next to at dinner. Fawkes could see Cassia's mouth hanging open in her peripheral vision. Raised in a militarum penal regiment, Yarrick would have loomed nearly as large in her spiritual world as the Emperor himself did. But the girl was in Fawkes's world now, and the Lord Inquisitor believed that if you made it your business to understand aliens, it was a good first step to be realistic about humans.
You have met him, then?
Inquired Biter, doing a bad job of pretending not to be interested. Yes, twice.
And did he talk about Gazcool much?
Fawkes snorted with faint amusement as she considered her reply. If you mean to ask, did Yarrick consider Gazcool to be his grod? Well, I can certainly confirm he hated him with every fibre of his being. That seemed to satisfy Makari, at least, when Biter passed it on to the grot.
Enough of Yarrick,
Hendrickson said irritably, for he too had met the legendary commissar and held an opinion even more pronounced than Fawkes's.
Did you come back again?
Fawkes was amazed, frankly. During the prisoner's relating of Gazcool's squabbles on Urk, Brother Hendrickson couldn't have shown more contempt for the story and its narrator. Now that Makari's story had taken on the air of a reincarnation saga, however, not unlike some of the more outlandish tales told around braziers of psychotropic herbs in the shaman's caves of Fenris, the rune priest had become noticeably more gripped.
Well, they are here in the room,
needled Biter, not missing the opportunity to provoke the wolf.
So I think yes, they must have done at some point.
You're not exactly what I'm asking, warned the Astartes, and Biter stopped pushing their luck.
Gazcal came round eventually. I knew he would. But I don't mean that in a reconciliatory way. He decided he wanted to bring me back, I mean. But it weren't anything to do with faith or the Great Green. He just thought it'd be a useful tool. Or even just something to shut the mobs up, because they kept asking where that good old banner waver of his had gone. It was in the middle of a fight the first time, and you'll find this easier to get through your too thin skull than the last time I came back, because there was none of that business of being a normal grot first. One moment I was just an idea in a load of fungus or whatever, minding my own business, and then I was in a trench, pointing a rusty blast gun over a parapet with shaking hands. I stumbled and fell down off the firing step, because it turned out that this Makari had a leg binned at some point and replaced with a bit of wood, and I hadn't been ready for that. But as I got back to my feet and tried to climb back up the steps so I could see over the trench lip, a hand came down out of the red-black sky and yanked the blast gun off me.
Then I'll get him, if it'll stop you going on about it,
thundered Gazcal from somewhere above me. for the hand was his, and a second later he plunged back down and shoved that battered old banner into my hand. Well, I say it was the old banner, but that's an interesting one. Throughout the last war, the banner had taken a lot of bullets that should have hit me, and one of my few official duties had been to patch it up with scrap and repaint it each time. By the time he left Armageddon, the banner was more than half patches, and I'd redone the picture on it so many times that I think I'd accidentally became a good painter. Though I never did get the expression on his face right. Now, though, by the looks of it, the banner had been shot up so much that not only was there none of the original metal left, but there weren't even any of the patches left. In fact, it was 3 times the size now, and the painting on it, well, it was a disgrace. Gazcal looked like some kind of rubbish gargant, and whoever drew him couldn't do hands at all. Clearly, a long, long time had gone by, but I was more bothered by the fact that someone else had been using my banner. Probably the orc lying face down on the trench floor with a fresh hole through its head, I reckoned, as the giant hand clamped around my shoulder and turned me round to face the body and the crowd of orcs around it. The dead orc had been wearing a ridiculous hat, a bit like some of the human preachers we'd seen on Armageddon, which now lay in the rubble next to its burst bonce. I wondered if this had been Gazkal's attempt to invent an orc version of a preacher, and felt embarrassed for the corpse.
"There, Makari,"
said Gazkal, sounding annoyed, and there was a quick fizzle of pain where his hand lay on my shoulder as it gave me the hand mark. It felt insincere, barely even hurt.
"Happy now?"
growled the boss.
"You've got your proper banner waver again. Count yourself lucky I didn't just kill you for asking for the millionth time. Now shut up about it and take that wreck."
"All right, Makari," said Bullets, nodding at me, because it was him Gazkal had been talking to. The Death Skull, who'd been young when he'd been promoted to clan boss over Dregmek's carcass, looked well old now. He'd always been big, but he must have been half as tall again now, and while he'd once been skinny as a whip, his gut finally got jealous of his shoulders. Bullets had always been good to me. Treated me like dirt, obviously, but in the right way. "Missed you," he said, which made me scowl, so he added, "You little turd," for good measure. Next to Bullets were some orcs I recognised, and some I didn't. There was Ugrak, who was wearing a suit of Giga armour so big that I thought he was a dread, until I saw those wonky eyes leering at me from 2 different stories of his bucket-shaped helmet. Then there was Shazfrag, who looked like he'd been blown up and rebuilt a few times, and Grudbolg, who'd already been ancient on Urk and now looked like something that had been under a bog for 1,000,000 years and was pissed off about it. I didn't see Snazdacker there, and General Stratagem weren't in the trench either, but there was a much younger orc who looked to be wearing his uniform.
"The General had had an unfortunate accident," said Biter regretfully, placing their mildewed cap on their chest in a ludicrous gesture of remembrance. "But, fortunately, he'd been replaced by an ambitious young officer with an even greater grasp of the art of fights. This was none other than Colonel Tacticus," they revealed, saying the name as if anyone in the room might have had reason to care. "Freshly returned from a long and devious struggle against a brilliant adversary wherein he learned—" The blood axe rambled on, but Makari had long since stopped talking and looked confused, annoyed, and slightly alarmed all at once. "Biter," said Folks patiently. "Nobody asked," she told them, at the same moment as Makari snapped at the orc with what she was prepared to bet were the same words in its tongue. Biter cleared their throat awkwardly. "Sorry," they said, forcing the distinctly un-orcish word between their tusks. "I just had a lot of respect for him is all. It's a blood axe thing."
Anyway, there was no more time for looking about. Gazkal had given an order, and he didn't do that for fun. Soon as he'd spoken to me, Bullets raised his head and bellowed the order to charge down the trench, then leapt up to the parapet with an agility that all those years and extra tins of grub had clearly done little to diminish. He grabbed me as he jumped, plopping me in the rubble on the other side of the trench, and I looked out, with the oversized banner in hand, at the biggest war I'd ever seen. There was a city in front of us so big, I thought it was a mountain. I thought it was loads of mountains, to be honest. And in front of it, on a wide plain of scrubby green weeds, war machines were knocking each other to bits on a scale that made the best laughs of Gazgal's southward push look boring. It was all so big that it took me a couple of seconds to realise the plain weren't covered in weeds at all. That was orcs, that was. More than I'd ever seen in any life. It was so vast, so fighty, that I didn't even glance away from it when I saw Gazkal's enormous boot plod forward to the left of me in the corner of my vision. He'd not even spoken to me after bringing me back, and seemed to have forgotten me already, so I didn't see why I should bother paying attention to him. And he had murdered me after all. But then it wasn't like he'd not been entitled to kill me, and it would have been worth it if he'd eventually looked back on that chat we'd had and come to his senses about Armageddon. Looking out at that big fight, I gave in to one of my most ungrotly habits, and hoped. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was the start of the big one I tried to inspire him to. The first mighty step in a rampage that would drown the galaxy in green. It certainly looked big. But then I smelled sulphur. Not just sulphur, neither. Fuel and sewage and ash and rot and hot rock. This nose weren't put there by Mork for decoration, you know. Smells the best of a grot's senses, and it never forgets the smell of a place. The nose knows, and the nose knew then that I'd been here before. That city in front of us was Volcanus, the place where I'd begun my second life, only with a load of new fortifications. And this was gawk-smacked Armageddon again. The big idiot had gone back after all, and if he wanted me to wave his stick for him as he squandered his destiny here, he could forget about it. In fact, it wasn't even like he properly wanted that. He'd only summoned me to stop Bullet's gob. And as I thought it through, I realised that he'd probably been being, is sarcastic the word? Fine, he'd be saying to Bullets. You want Makari back? You care that much about a grot holding a stick? Well, here's one for you. The only thing was, Gazkal's will was so powerful he could make a whole person exist just by saying something he didn't mean. I looked out at that big pointless fight and at Gazkal's back as he ploughed into it and realised I was an accident. Nothing more than a throwaway point in a conversation the boss had already forgotten. And I know it ain't right for a grot to think highly of itself, but I knew it was more than that. You remember they always said I was lucky? Well, I still was. But that didn't mean Bullets couldn't hit me, just meant I didn't want them to, and they tended to oblige. That sense of preservation weren't such a concern to me now. Quite the opposite. And given the proper hurricane of bullets that was heading towards the Orc line, now that charge had started, the sort of luck I was after weren't hard at all to manufacture. In fact, there was a nice little stream of rounds smacking into a dead Orc just a few steps away. Some gunner whose aim was off, probably. I decided to help him out. The last thing I heard was the ringing thuds of the banner gaining a load of new holes, and the little wet rips as my body did too. I was dead before I hit the ground.
Do you think Gazkul realised it was actually you? Asked Folks.
Makari thinks Bullets realised,
Biter clarified.
and that he must have told Gazkul given what happened after.
So it happened again, she suggested, raising an eyebrow.
Oh, yeah,
said Biter, as Makari held out its unbroken arm plus both legs and began counting off fingers and toes, muttering under its breath all the while. After losing count and starting again twice, the grot abandoned the effort with a shrug, and Biter passed the gesture on to Folks.
Many times,
they summarised. But if Gaz had a purpose for you and summoned you to do it, asked Cassia, gnawing on her lip as she tried to reason her way through Makari's sordid moral universe, weren't you dishonouring Gork and Mork by giving him the slip every time?
Nah,
came the translated reply.
just Gaz. I don't think he knew what the gods wanted in them days. Don't think he cared.
But still, Cassia continued, with something of her old penal legion hardness creeping into her tone, he gave you an order. That made Makari laugh when Biter told it.
You really don't get grots, do you, big human? Remember what I told you earlier about how it ain't ungodly for a grot to try escaping its master since it means the York has to prove their right to power by stopping them? Well, this was just that, but more.
Makari went on to narrate a seemingly endless, increasingly creative series of summonings from Gaz, followed almost immediately by equally inventive deaths on Makari's part. And from the way the Gretchen told it, it seemed that each time the two met, however briefly, the Orc warlord had become ever more despondent. It was becoming clear that the malaise which had consumed the Orc during the siege of Hades' Hive had never truly gone away. The gods, or whatever aspect of madness he interpreted as their voices, she corrected herself piously, had maintained their silence inside his ravaged skull. And as the war for Armageddon had escalated into the apocalyptic perpetual stalemate of its peak, it seemed Gazkul's weakness had taken hold of him again. Folks felt this was a line of inquiry that could stand a little further pressure. If the progression of battles, I'm inferring from these, morbid vignettes is correct, she said, stopping Biter mid-flow as they described Makari beating itself to death with a wrench. Then we must be nearing the point at which Gazkul was last sighted on Armageddon, and I'm guessing that Makari may know something about why he left. When the interpreter put this to her captive, Makari stayed tight-lipped at first. In the slowly swaying light of the cell's bulb, its eyes slid in and out of shadow, seeming bright with fury during one illumination, and then gloomy with remorse in the next. Once again, Folks was exasperated by the futility of trying to deduce the grot's feelings from a face only capable of variations on the theme of malice. Eventually, however, Makari broke out into a wicked grin.
Yes,
said Biter. They say they do.
Chapter 9. Gazkul's Epiphany.
I ain't gonna say sorry,
said Gazkul, glowering down at me from the reddest sky I ever saw.
I ain't gonna say sorry,
he repeated, as his hand left my shoulder and he straightened up to his full height.
'Cause I'll never say that to anyone. Not to any other orc, not to the gods themselves, and definitely not to a grot, no matter what a devious, infuriating little piece of work he is.
A thick bank of smoke blew across the boss, obscuring him, then flashed from the inside with a vicious light as the cannon strapped to his claw opened up against some target hidden deeper in the murk. I didn't hear it, though, or at least I didn't notice the noise, because every nerve in my body was screaming green bloody murder at the pain of the burn where he'd touched me. Felt like it seared through to the bone this time, and it was all I could do not to drop the banner that I now realised was clenched in the claws of my left hand. But as the pain started fading into a raw, sullen throb, I thought about what he'd just said to me. For a start, it was the first time since he'd killed me, the first time during this whole ridiculous campaign, that he'd actually spoken directly to me. devious, infuriating little piece of work, he said. And I ain't vain, 'cause a grot shouldn't be. But nobody minds being flattered all the same, and that had been some high praise indeed. My impulse on waking up had been to find a bullet to get in the way of, but if he was going to talk to me like that, I figured, maybe I'd hear him out. And besides, there was something different to him this time that I couldn't quite put my claw on. He just seemed more him.
Cork thrash your hide, Makari,
Gazkel cursed, growling the words like gravel as the smoke cleared and he reloaded the cannon.
You've given me some headaches, you have. But headaches are where I do my best thinking. And so, Makari, I've been thinking, follow.
With the hiss and clank of pistons, Gazkel turned and began to stomp ponderously up the steep slope of broken rock in the direction he fired his gun. Only it weren't rock, I noticed, when I looked down to start scrambling after him. It was little fragments of armour that had been blown up so many times they was almost like gravel. As my mind got settled in its new hidey hole, I became aware of a lot of shouting everywhere and a lot of explosions.
And like I ain't saying sorry,
the boss explained, as his feet shifted whole dunes of smashed-up metal and ceramite in his climb up the ridge.
I ain't saying I was wrong either. I wasn't wrong to kill you, and I wasn't wrong in coming back to this world.
I hopped between the little platforms of flattened scree his feet had left, using the banner pole to steady me until I arrived, wheezing myself ragged at the top beside him. The smoke was back and obscured everything above Gazkel's waist, but I could hear him breathing deep somewhere up above it, like he was savouring something, like he could see something I couldn't. He breathed out long and steady.
Do you smell it, Makari?
He asked. I did. Smelled like bleeding Armageddon. But this weren't the time for smart answers, so I lurked, sitting myself on a cracked-open beaky helmet near his right boot.
Do you see it, Makari? What I've made here?
Course I didn't, 'cause of the smoke. But then the wind snatched it back again, and from the top of that ridge I saw the most beautiful, terrible thing. War it was, but written in the biggest letters you could find. Mega war, holy war. An echo of that perfect ancient violence that every orc knew deep down they'd been designed for. Machines so big they moved like clouds, carving each other up in great sloughs of sparks. A sea of bodies, orc and human, living and dead, flowing over a perfect wilderness of trenches and craters and pounded rubble. As I looked up from that divine catastrophe at its towering architect, my vision passed over swarms of aircraft, ours and theirs, it didn't matter, wheeling in flocks so dense they might have been smoke themselves and bursting in sudden bright clusters of death. My eyes moved up and up through that blizzard of fire and steel until they settled on it. Solid and deep green and immovable, at the heart and the crown of it all, the head of the prophet. He had his head tipped back, with one eye closed in rapture and leathery nostrils spread wide, like he was letting each sense have its turn to revel in what he'd done. But then I clocked it. That hadn't been the wind whipping the smoke away. It had been Gazkel breathing it all in so that I could see. He'd taken all that annihilation and fury and mayhem, the entire will and fury of 2 interstellar empires, and he'd only gone and bleeding smoked it. His chest swelled with enough war smoke to choke a whole mob of grots, and as he held it in, the clouds above him began to flash with light. There were shapes moving in that glow, huge shadows drifting into each other and smashing together in sprays of darkness. Spaceships, I realised. Massive things, savaging each other to scrap in a fight that made what was going on down here look rubbish. A fight so big we could only see it as shadows projected by the light of its own fury. Gazkel was still breathing in like he'd never run out of space inside himself, and as he did, One patch of light right over his head was getting brighter and brighter, like something was coming.
"This is holy Macari,"
said Gazco as the light got too bright to look at. And I swear to Mork, his lips didn't move, even though I heard the words as clear as anything in my head. When the light faded, his eye was open, looking right at me, and next to it, plunging down where it had punched through the sky, was a zogging great rock. A rock with guns all over it that fired in all directions as it came down, just for the joy of shooting. When the rock got halfway down the sky, a cluster of rockets, they must have been as big as a city, lit up on its arse end and started coming down even harder towards the ground. I held the banner up as high as it would go, and I couldn't help but shout at the top of my weedy lungs for the beauty of it all. But I never saw the rock hit, 'cause Gazcal grinned a grin as wide as Gawk's, and out from between his tusks came all of that smoke, thicker and angrier than it had been before, and covering everything I could see.
"Really does smell good, don't it?"
said Gazcal, and I had to agree, 'cause it did. And yeah, it was still the smell of Armageddon like I'd already known, the smell that made me decide to piss off at the start of the war. But now it was different, richer. There was a whole cluster of new scents layered in it. All the oils and potions that 100 different beaky mobs used to anoint their armour, and all the blood and guts left behind with that armour cracked. The sweat and terror of human soldiers from all across the galaxy, and the weird elements cooked up in the hearts of mech giga-weapons. It was a grand old smell.
"Come on, then,"
said Gazcal against the light of what must have been the rock smacking down in the ground. I saw his silhouette trudging off down the other side of the ridge. What are we attacking?" I asked, reckoning it'd be all right to ask a question.
"Nothing,"
said the boss simply.
"We're leaving."
Well, I hadn't expected that. "Doesn't look like we've won yet, though," I said, surprised that I felt so disappointed at the idea of leaving all of a sudden.
"Not yet,"
agreed Gazcal.
"We will mind. But me and you, we're done here."
As we walked across the battlefield in the smoke, Gazcal explained. And it was weird, because although I'd seen millions fighting from the top of that ridge, we only seemed to come across corpses, like everyone had gotten out of the way so we could talk. He'd made the war so big, he said, that the humans had been forced to ship in troops from a slice of space so big it took even starlight 1,000 years to get across it. Whole worlds worth of the puny gits had been fed into the grinder Gazgal had made of this planet, as well as enough steel to empty mines of whole star systems. There were many, and 5 different beaky mobs here, 6 great mobs of human gargants, and no less than many and 7 fleets of the humans' big pointy spaceships. And that wasn't even starting on the orcs. The boss had come here with a horde, sure enough. But unlike the first invasion, where they'd been chipped away by the war, this time round his forces had doubled every year. Orcs were flooding here from distant worlds, just like they flooded to Urk from the outer planets, because he said they'd felt it. They knew something was happening here, something special, and they didn't know exactly what it was, but in the same way a magnet wants to smash itself on steel, they wanted a part of it. It wasn't like the fight was just here either. Seeing as so many humans had been funnelled into this big scrap, there were loads of planets nearby just waiting for a good kicking, and Gazcal had already heard reports of massive invasions splitting off from his own, led by orcs he'd never even met, to go off and boot them to bits in his name.
"You wanted me to unite the orcs, Macari. Do you see now? That's exactly what I've done. I've done it just by fighting every step of the way. Fighting here, just like I said I would."
He paused for a moment, so I nearly scampered into the back of his shins, and turned back to point a talon at me. I couldn't see his face then, just the glow of his metal eye in the smoke, and when he spoke again, it was in a cold, hard voice that made the rest of the world seem to fall silent.
"So, don't ever doubt me again. Not ever. I took my time, yes, We both know I had, moments. But I found the best way. The way of the gods. And it led me here. That was always the plan. And that's the truth, 'cause I said so."
Then he carried on walking. Now, I remember things slightly different from that, but then, as I think you know better than you say you do, there's room in the idea of truth for more than one thing. And when Gaskell reckons something, other Jews just have to get out of the way and make room for it, yeah? Just like the prophet had walked a rust spike holding in his brain and fighting all those animals along the way, so too he'd planned for this all along. That's just what happened. After a while walking without saying anything, we stopped in the place Gaskell said we was meant to wait. The rock, he told me, had been a bit of fun to cover our escape. A distraction, so Yarrick, who'd not been too keen to be given the slip a second time, would be too busy to spot a single orc ship peel away from the fight in orbit. The clan bosses were already gone, he said, sent off to wars on their own at last, and I could only hope Grotznick had been forced to take the same privilege. It was just us now on Armageddon, at least of all the orcs I'd ever known, and in a little while the mechs machines would whisk us away into space. Gaskell stood and brooded about holy stuff, like he tends to do when he has to wait, and I made myself comfortable on a dead human without too many wet bits on it. It was eerily quiet here now, since the fight had moved off to the brutal new fronts left behind after the rock's impact. Every few seconds some dying human screamed somewhere in the gloom. That was quite relaxing, to be honest. It was one of them companionary silences. But thinking back, I could have sworn Gaskell had been gearing up to say something else to me and decided against it. And since I'd been born a cheeky git, and died as one many times, I couldn't help myself. "Boss?" I asked.
"Yeah,"
he answered in a tone that said I'd better choose my words dead carefully. You were saying that you wasn't sorry, and that you wasn't wrong about killing me or coming here, but that you been thinking about it all."
"I was saying that."
"Well, it sounded like there might have been a bit more in that train of thought that you ain't said yet." Gaskell stared at me for ages, but he looked curious more than he looked angry.
"I have no idea what Mork was thinking when he made you, Grot,"
he said at last, rubbing his skull plate with the heel of his hand.
"But it was a one-off job."
He sighed, then marched right up to me and spoke.
"It was the headaches, all right. They got worse. And for all the work Grotznick did, it barely seemed to slow him down."
Funny that, I thought.
"I thought they'd maybe get better when we landed here, and they did for a bit, but then they started getting worse again. You remember a few months back when you beat yourself to death with that wrench?"
"Yeah," I said, scratching my face so he wouldn't see me grin.
"Made me angry, Makari. Really angry. A fit came on me right in front of all the bosses, and I had to start fighting one of them to cover it. I won, of course, and there was no hard feelings, but it was close, and it made me think about why I was getting the headaches."
"Was it the gods, boss?"
"Yeah, Makari. It was the gods. They've been speaking to me this whole time. I thought they'd gone quiet. They've been speaking to me by kicking me in the head. What does it mean when I kick someone in the head?"
"That you want them to listen?"
"Right. So in the end I listened, and at last it all made sense."
Gaskell looked up into the swirling silent smoke and sighed again.
"The gods saw what I did here the last time. They saw Golgotha, and they'd seen all this. They looked on it and saw it was good. But they'd grown impatient, Makari, like I was looking down at that brawl from the balcony on Urk, when I realised how much more it could be."
He swept his claw all around him then, leaving little eddies in the smoke where it caught on the pointy bits.
"Turns out there's too much of a good thing.
And you saw just now how good this is. But it's as good as it'll get. The lightning's all bottled up and it can't get any bigger. What's happening here needs to happen everywhere. And that's what we're off to do now. I nodded because he still hadn't said the thing I knew he'd been doing everything to avoid saying, but he was nearly there. And, well, I suppose what I'm saying, Macari, is not that I'm sorry, he said for the 5th time, or that I was wrong, he said for the 5th time too, and then growled in frustration. And by Gork and Mork and the Great Green itself, I swear you really are the luckiest grots who ever crawled out of a hole that I'm even considering saying this to you, but... He grimaced, like a normal orc might at the prospect of a session under Grotsnick's knife, coming to the edge of it, but shuffling slower and slower with every step.
You?
But he didn't get any further than that, because there was a squeaky, rumbly, clanking noise, and we both looked round to see a big shadow limping through the smoke. A human tank it was, absolutely knackered, with a load of shell holes in it and half the tracks hanging off on one side. That was a surprise, as I thought all the armies had moved on by now. But then I suppose Gork and Mork can be quite creative sometimes when they really need to make a point. The tank's turret swivelled round with a sound like a snotling getting poked with a drill. There was a hollow thud from somewhere inside it, and it fired. Gazkal made a confused face and looked down at the hole in the armour right over where his guts were.
They shot me,
he observed, like it didn't make sense. You all right, boss? I asked, as if the tank just sat there like it didn't know what to do.
Oh, yeah, he said. Armour'll need patching up, but I don't think it went in. Always said I had the hardest gut around.
He poked a claw tip into the hole and peered down his chest at it.
Huh! Warhead didn't even go off.
And then the warhead went off. A fountain of blood and shrapnel shot from the hole in Gazkal's armour, and the prophet of Gork and Mork keeled over backwards. The only sound then was the squeak of the hatch on the tank's turret as a human face peered out with a look of such shock that I thought his eyes had fallen out. It started screaming down into the tank, presumably for someone to get another shell loaded, and I could hear the frantic shouts from inside, even when the hatch slammed shut again. I scampered over to where Gazkal's head lay, on the smashed-up armour that covered the plane, and I realised I had no idea what to do. He weren't dead. It was just a tank shell after all, and he was Gazkal. But he'd be out of it for a few minutes, and hurt enough that it'd take him a few hours to recover. Problem was, he didn't have a few minutes before that tank was going to fire again. I almost wish Grotsnick had been there. He'd at least have known how to sort this out. But then my nasty little head got to work, and I had my own answer. "Do with it, boss," I said a minute or so later, as I picked a lump of gore that I missed off my hand and picked up the banner from where I'd left it leaning on Gazkal's chest.
What?
Said Gazkal, his eye narrowing groggily as he came to. It was easy. I heard the humans in the tank even when the hatch was closed, and I knew there had to be a reason. Then I remembered all the holes in it, and I figured one of them at least had to be grot-sized it was. I grinned, and in the reflection of the lens of the prophet's metal eye, I saw all the bits of flesh still stuck between my sharp little teeth. Didn't take long after that, boss. Wish you could have seen their faces, though.
All right,
said Gazkal, and took a deep, shuddering breath before clenching his jaw and sitting up.
All right,
he said again, and I saw that he was looking up at the sky where the gods probably were.
You've made your point. I'll say it. Macari.
Yes, boss?
You were right. The gods wanted me to unite the orcs. There. Now let's go and turn the stars green.